Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan, and if you've watched us before, but honestly, even if you haven't watched us before, you are probably very familiar with the idea of a right to counsel. And traditionally, most people understand it in the criminal court context, where somebody gets arrested and they're automatically told if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you. Now, that phrase describes the constitutional right of people facing criminal charges to be represented by an attorney. But this same right does not exist in civil court. And civil court covers a range of issues having to do with marriage and child custody, and really importantly, the life and death matter of housing. And there's no right to counsel in civil eviction proceedings, which means that the overwhelming majority of people who are being kicked out of their homes end up going through this really grueling, complex, and unfair process without the assistance of an attorney, whereas most landlords are represented by attorneys. And this makes sense, really. If you can't afford rent, you probably can't afford a lawyer. And this dynamic leads to some really horrible outcomes for people who are facing evictions. Most people who don't have legal representation end up not showing up to court at all, perhaps because they understand that there's a very small chance that they're going to have a favorable outcome, particularly when they're going up against well-resourced landlords who in many cases, most cases really, have lawyers. And in a recent commentary piece for The Appeal, Emily Benfer, who is the founding director of the Wake Forest Law, Health, and Justice Clinic, breaks down some of the most devastating consequences associated with evictions, which include, quote, homelessness, poor physical and mental health conditions, job loss, and an eviction record that will make obtaining future housing extremely difficult. Benfer also notes that all of these injustices affect Black and Latinx renters the most. And so with evictions set to explode in the coming months, as state and federal protections for renters begin to expire, these problems could balloon and explode. And one thing that policymakers can do to help protect tenants is to extend this right to counsel to eviction proceedings. By ensuring renters have legal representation during this process, many of the worst and most damaging consequences of evictions could be avoided. And so joining me now to talk more about implementing a right to counsel in eviction cases is Emily Benfer, who in addition to her position at Wake Forest Law is also chair of the American Bar Association COVID-19 Task Force Committee on Evictions. So Emily, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So before we talk about solutions, I want to ask you to talk about the scale of this looming crisis. Do you have a sense of how many families are currently treading water and could be subject to eviction proceedings as the moratoriums begin to expire?
More than we have ever seen are facing eviction at this moment. At the peak of the pandemic over the summer, around 30 to 40 million families were facing eviction. And many of those families since that time have already been displaced, that they have been pushed out of their homes, that they've left almost voluntarily because they did not want to face eviction court and all of the harms that come from that. But still, so many households are being threatened with eviction in this moment, millions more than we've ever seen in the past. In a typical year, we usually see about 3.6 million evictions across the country. And so in a very truncated amount of time, we're looking at 10 times that level or even more during the pandemic.
So in your piece in The Appeal, you specifically talk about some of the racial and socioeconomic inequities that are present in evictions, and also talk about how those are even exacerbated when there's a child in the household. So can you talk to us a little bit about how the evictions process disproportionately harms people of color, lower income families, and families generally, really?
Absolutely. Even before the pandemic, eviction was always targeted toward Black households and Hispanic households at the highest rates. 80% of people facing eviction were Black in a study of multiple cities. And prior to the pandemic, Black households faced eviction at 2 times the rate of their white counterparts. Black women face eviction at the highest rates, and the single greatest predictor of eviction, according to studies, is the presence of a child. So the people who are at the most risk of eviction are moms and their kids. And that's especially true during the pandemic. And at the outset of the pandemic, 50 million people living in renter households said that someone in their household had lost wages or jobs because of the pandemic shutdown. So due to the extraordinary circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic, the risk of eviction and the host of harms that can be lifelong and actually affect the life course are facing eviction in this moment. And so this is something that we can prevent entirely, but part of that prevention requires actually rectifying the injustice and the imbalance in the eviction system itself.
So talk to us about those sorts of long life consequences that you just mentioned. I quoted your piece at the top a little bit, which talks a little bit about that, but can you really elaborate on what's at stake when it comes to eviction? In some ways, this is really a matter of life or death, perhaps especially for children and pregnant women. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Right, and that's absolutely right. And I think that's the best way to put this, that especially during a pandemic, eviction is a matter of life and death. That studies have demonstrated, multiple studies now, that lifting a moratorium, that the absence of a moratorium, that eviction itself actually increases the risk of transmission of COVID-19, of infection, and of mortality. And the people who are facing eviction also are the most likely to suffer from comorbidities or other diseases that would put them at the highest risk of mortality or complications if they contract COVID-19. So this truly is a matter of protecting public health, but also saving lives in the process. But eviction itself, in addition to the very severe threats that it places during a pandemic and during COVID-19, it also has severe outcomes for physical and mental health and for well-being. It leads to higher mortality, to respiratory disease, to high blood pressure, poor self-rated care or health, and a host of other issues, including coronary heart disease, independent of any other causes. For mental health, as you might imagine, it is incredibly stressful to be faced with the possibility of losing the roof over your home or the ability to keep your family housed. So it's linked with depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and exposure to violence at the same time. For women, it is particularly harmful. It's associated with increased sexual and physical assault. And for children, it's a trauma. It is a traumatic experience. It's so much more than finding another place to live. It's watching your toys and your books and your clothes and your bed left on the side of the street or carted off to storage where you may never see it again. It results in moving to substandard housing, to exposure to lead hazards that cause permanent brain damage, to food insecurity. And at a time when we're learning how to teach students in a different way, it leads to academic decline because you're shifting from house to house and school district to school district. And all of this, it's even associated with decreased life expectancy. So it's having an effect across the life course. And one last study I'll tell you about, in a recent study from the Eviction Lab of Georgia, they found that women who are evicted when they're pregnant are much more likely to have adverse birth outcomes for their infant, including low birth weight or preterm pregnancies. And that can have a host of problems well into the future for that child. So all of this is to say that nothing good comes out of eviction, and we haven't even gotten to the barriers to livelihood that it creates as well.
So for those who are watching who may not be well versed in this or who aren't lawyers, I think the idea of evictions having all of these really devastating impacts is pretty clear. But I think what's a little bit unclear is sort of just how deeply unfair the process itself is. So maybe, and luckily you're a professor, so that helps us. You can teach our viewers. Maybe you can walk us through what an eviction process looks like, where a tenant is trying to fight in court without legal representation, to sort of show our viewers sort of how stacked against them this process is.
Yeah, so the eviction system itself is incredibly imbalanced and inequitable. There are multiple points within the system when a tenant could exercise their rights, but it requires knowledge of those rights and the ability to do so. At the very outset, tenants are supposed to receive notice, and sometimes the lease can be noticed, but oftentimes tenants don't receive that notice or are not aware of what it means, that they have the right to actually appear in court and to raise defenses, many tenants will vacate the unit at the first sign of an eviction. So that notice for them means that they have to leave, even though they should have rights in this process. And then the second stage is when the landlord files that case and a tenant is supposed to receive summons, but oftentimes they don't, or that notice to appear in a court doesn't have their name on it, or perhaps it lists their children as defendants or people who are not party to the lease. And all of those would be a due process violation under the notice parameters that they could use to appeal their case or to have it overturned. And then the hearing itself, most tenants don't appear because they've seen what happens to their neighbors, that the vast majority, almost 100% of eviction hearings result in an order of eviction for that tenant, even when they have defenses. In a study of eviction court in Chicago, when tenants had defenses, and over 60% did, none of them were actually overturned because of that tenant's rights in that case. And that was when they did not have counsel present to represent them and help them exercise those rights. Today, when we have a nationwide eviction moratorium in place, numerous studies of eviction court have shown that very few tenants are able to understand and exercise their rights and to produce a declaration that could prevent their family from facing eviction and could actually keep them housed. So once that order is issued, it is then delivered to the sheriff or law enforcement who execute it and actually remove the family from the home. But all of that still requires notice and summons, and many tenants don't receive that. And so you can see there are so many points in the system where a tenant should be able to exercise their rights but can't. And then if they want to appeal their case, many states require that tenants post bond or pay multiple months to a year worth of rent just to be able to exercise their appeal rights. So we've limited access to this system to people who can afford it and to a small subset of the population who are very unlikely to be even engaging with that system at all. And that's on top of laws and policies that are often very favorable toward a property owner, that make it possible for property owners to engage in what's called serial eviction practices, where they use the court as a way to remind people to pay the rent, as opposed to a way to gain access to the property or to recoup that property. And so the imbalance in rights that favor landlords, combined with this completely inaccessible system, has created a crisis that is not only about right to housing, but also about public health, and because of all the ramifications of eviction and how it follows you throughout your life as well.
So you went through sort of a few examples for us of ways that the system is unfair, and particularly for people who don't have lawyers representing them in eviction proceedings. And I'm thinking, and let's talk about just one of these examples. So you said, for example, somebody receives a summons and it's incorrect in one way or the other. Maybe it's addressed to their child or addressed to, I remember reading one case where it was addressed to a Jane Doe who didn't even live there. So talk to us about how, if somebody who received a summons like that had a lawyer, how that case could go differently.
That case wouldn't even happen if that person had a lawyer. The lawyer would immediately recognize that that was improper notice, that it violated due process rights, and they would have sought to have it thrown out, which would have required that the landlord refile the case properly, following laws and policies and procedures that are in place to protect people's rights. And in that moment, that could have compelled the property owner to think about settling, to think about whether or not they had complied with housing code, with building code, and other laws and policies to ensure that what they were requiring of that tenant was actually adhering with the law itself. And so having an attorney in that moment could have prevented not only the case from going forward, but it could also prevent that tenant from having a record of eviction that would haunt them throughout their life trying to seek housing in the future. That this record of eviction is searchable, and property owners often use it to screen future applicants out of safe and decent housing. This is why eviction is considered the scarlet E that haunts families as they're trying to piece their lives back together. It results in pushing people to the outskirts of the rental market, to unsafe neighborhoods, to underperforming schools, to substandard housing, because that's all that's left when you've been screened out. Even if you won your case, even if it was thrown out eventually, All of these are things that attorneys can help with getting that record sealed in states that allow it, with ensuring that you're heard in that process. But right now, in this moment, with 90% of tenants unrepresented in the majority of states and even less in rural areas, most rights are going unrecognized, unraised, and for that reason, violated.
Hearing everything you just said, a right to counsel, it makes so much sense and should for everyone, because it's not even about giving tenants something that it's about making it so that landlords have to follow the law. Right. That's really it. And so I'm wondering, why aren't policies everywhere just sort of automatically doing this? Who's standing in the way of it, and what arguments are they using to resist it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think about, in the inverse, why are we seeing such a movement right now, the adoption of right to counsel across the country at the same time? And I think both answers are very similar, that the difference is the power. Who has the ability to influence policymakers and lawmakers? And for a really long time, the landlord lobby, the apartment association lobby, real estate lobby, they have had the most power, the loudest voice. They were able to reach decision makers in a way that tenants couldn't, because when tenants raise their voices individually, they're often retaliated against. That's often when they see that eviction notice on their door. And so now we're seeing an increase of tenant associations, of organizing of tenants, of protests by tenants across the country. And so in solidarity, collectively, they're raising their voices, and so they're so much louder together, and there's safety in numbers, and people are able to understand exactly what's at stake right now, and there's funding available. So I think this lack of voice, the lack of funding that was dedicated to this issue, that while people should all be able to access their rights, that's what they're there for, those types of some of those fallacies that are involved in this have all been corrected in this moment. So we have this perfect opportunity to recognize the needs of renters in this moment, that in this extraordinary period of time where they were suffering from job and wage loss for no fault of their own, simply because we were all trying to comply with pandemic mitigation strategies, that this is a moment where people must have a right to counsel, especially because their rights are available, that they have a legitimate defense to eviction in this moment. And the aftermath of this will require counsel as well. And at the same time, there's funding available, so there's no reason why we shouldn't be implementing this, especially if everyone is actually adhering to their rights. There's nothing to really be afraid of in that matter, that landlords should know that if their rights are being upheld, the tenants should at the same time. So this is really about balancing that tilt.
I'm also glad that you brought up the sort of the support for a right to counsel, because we've seen that this is something that voters support. Yeah. Earlier this year, we conducted a Data for Progress in the Lab, which is a project of the Appeal, conducted a poll that found that 68% of voters, including 75% of Democrats, 71% of independents, and 58% of Republicans, support a right to counsel in eviction proceedings. So from your experience, do you think that the most vocal opponents of a right to counsel and other efforts to protect tenants from evictions, do you think they're aware that people like this, or do they just not care?
The opponents of right to counsel? Mm-hmm. I imagine they're aware. I think that anyone who's in court day after day, in eviction court and hearings, is watching this play out, where they're seeing an enormous difference, that when you add right to counsel, 86% of tenants stay in their homes. 86%. But when you take that away, almost zero stay in their homes. That screams of grave injustice. And when you think about who it's affecting the most, people of color, families, children, and the downward trajectory that it's setting them off on, anything but right to counsel is willfully withholding rights and creating this redlining on repeat, where those sordid laws and policies that resulted in this moment, where people of color are the most likely to be facing eviction because they have the least amount of safety net in place due to those racially discriminatory laws and policies of the past, that we will be repeating that in this moment if we withhold those rights, if we allow a system that is so deeply imbalanced and inequitable to continue. That's our contribution in this moment. But the alternative, ensuring that everyone has access to their rights, that they can raise them, that they know how to navigate that system, which you really do need. These laws and policies are extremely complicated. Just to give you an example, in tracking the eviction moratoriums across the country at the state level, an eviction moratorium in one state can require reading as many as 10 different orders together and then going through about 4 or 5 statutes that already exist in that state. I can't imagine being a tenant trying to figure out how I'm going to feed my family and keep a roof over my head, and also have the time and ability to track down all of those laws and policies just to understand whether or not I can stay in my home. But you have an attorney there to do that for you, who can stand up beside you and argue your rights on your behalf. And there is strength in that, there is power, and that is the way that justice was designed.
And I also want to talk a little bit about this is obviously something that is just from a human standpoint that jurisdiction should be pushing, but talk to us about sort of the fiscal benefits of implementing a right to counsel. This is something you've written on, and we also have seen that implementing a right to counsel is cheaper than providing care for the result of people who get evicted. So talk to us about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, the advisory firm Stout, Reeses, and Ross, they've been studying right to counsel in the jurisdictions that have adopted it, and they found that they save money for jurisdictions. That in Baltimore, the effort was expected to cost $5.7 million annually, and it actually recouped $35.6 million in savings. This is related to the cost of keeping people in their homes, that they would avoid the cost of the homeless shelter system, of transitional housing, the cost of Medicaid that's associated with emergency room visits or inpatient care, including foster care. Oftentimes eviction splits families up because that's considered to be unsafe if you're sleeping in your car or moving from house to house just to keep a roof over your family's heads. And so they're forcibly removed after they lose their housing. So all of these are savings that are recouped from the city or the state that adopts this. And these show that right to counsel is not only financially feasible, but it's also preventing a cascade of consequences that are entirely preventable and that can also lead to that long-term harm well into the future.
About the jurisdictions that have caught on to the message. Which jurisdictions have made progress on this front, and tell us about the sorts of results we're seeing in those areas.
Yeah, well, it's really exciting to see for the first time ever, 2 states have passed right to counsel, Maryland and Washington State. I believe Washington State is on the verge of that right now. So we're really seeing a statewide effort take place. And I can't imagine how thrilling it will be, a year from now, to look back and see how many people remain in their homes because of that right to counsel across the state. Just imagine the benefits that they will reap, not only in the cost savings, but also children who are going to avoid that trauma, and the pregnancies that will be able to carry to term, the mental and physical health issues that were avoided. So not just cost savings for the state, but incredible benefits to health and well-being for individuals and families, and that will have ripple effects all throughout that community. And in this moment, where we have $45 billion in rental assistance being just infusing into communities across the country, but few communities have actually seen those dollars in the hands of the renters or the landlords who need it the most. And so in this moment, right to counsel can actually help keep people in those homes and to access those funds at the same time. So I think we will see much more in the way of this picking up speed. And as more states and cities adopt it, others will be looking over to see what they've done and the success they've had. And I think it will largely become quite immeasurable into the future because of the benefits of staying home.
So in terms of keeping people home, what else besides right to counsel do lawmakers and other officials need to be considering as we head towards this eviction cliff?
Yeah, so I think the next measure that must be introduced swiftly is record sealing and record expungement. I had mentioned that eviction record haunts families as they try to piece their lives together after an eviction, or even if they win their case, that if they try to seek alternative housing, they're often screened out of that because of that permanent eviction record. It does not go away after 7 years like a credit score issue might. It stays permanent and searchable. And this is incredibly harmful, especially because oftentimes courts don't check to see who's been listed as a defendant. And so we've had clients that are children or are people who are just staying in the household but are not on the lease, or young adults who are staying home to help out with expenses but haven't really started out on their own yet. And the moment they try to, they're going to be blocked out of communities that have access to opportunity because that record will follow them. There are about 6 states that have record sealing laws in place that either the tenant exercises, where they have to petition for it, they have to request that the court seal that record. Many tenants don't know how to do that. They don't know that that right exists, but when they have an attorney, the attorney makes sure that it happens, that they're the ones who petition for that. So that's another way that I think attorneys are useful in those states. But this is a policy that we should have across the country. With 30 to 40 million people at risk of eviction right now, all of those households will be pushed to the outskirts of our communities and our society if they don't have access to safe and decent housing. And having an eviction record is exactly what that will do. So we want to make sure that this doesn't haunt them throughout their life, that it doesn't affect their credit score in a damaging way, because it wasn't their fault that they lost their jobs or wages. That was directly due to the withholding of legal protections and financial support when we issued pandemic mitigation strategies that shut down jobs and that shuttered businesses across the country. So that's the first one that I think is really critical. And then I think we need to start working on correcting this imbalanced eviction system across the country. We need just cause and clean hands laws that would prevent actions for eviction that are just veiled discrimination attempts. This will require landlords to comply with habitability laws, like the home is actually safe and decent, doesn't have lead hazards or infestations or mold, and other laws prior to evicting a tenant. So I think that's just a start.
Thank you so much for joining us here on the Appeal Live today, and for all the work that you're doing. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
So if you haven't already, I recommend to our viewers to check out Emily's piece in The Appeal. She does a great explainer on the eviction crisis here in the United States. And she starts out that piece by talking about a mother, her name was Samantha, who needed to move out of her home as the result of an eviction. She was living in a 1-bedroom apartment with her seven children. And in the piece, she talks about sort of the long-term impacts of having been evicted, which included her children developing asthma, speech and development delays, anxiety, and frequent illness that required hospital stays. And in effect, noting that her children weren't allowed to be children. And so we see the devastating impact that being evicted can have on families across this country, paired with the ease of getting rid of that impact simply by giving people lawyers who will be able to make sure that the laws that are designed to protect them are actually followed. And so the idea of a right to counsel is quite simple. It's not anything radical. It's really just saying, hey, there are these laws on the books that are designed to help people. We want to make sure that they can actually help people. And so it's super exciting to see that traction is starting to move when it comes to gaining a right to counsel across the country, because that's what voters want. That's what people in this country want. They want to have an eviction process that is fair and where people can assert their rights against what is right now an unfair and unbalanced system. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you again for joining us on The Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news. We'll see you next time.